Hey everyone, welcome to another Patreon topic video. This one is by far, hands down, the most challenging of all that I've been given. I've done so much research, recorded about 15, 16 takes. This is a tough subject, so hopefully it'll come together. The subject was requested by MAZ, and the topic is, he wants me to discuss the history of Donpachi and the history of Sorcerer Striker, also known, here's the Japanese, Mahou Daisakusen. Hopefully that's correct. I'll call it Sorcerer Striker because my Japanese is not good at all. Anyway, he wants me to talk about the history of these two games and the history of the two studios, Cave and Raising, during this time, and how these two games were basically a linchpin, a bridge between the older style of shmups, stuff like Spriggan, Thunder Force, Batsugun even though it's kind of a little more on the bullet hell side of things. But those older classic style shmups to moving towards the famous bullet hell Donmaku shmups of Cave and stuff like that. Or of Raising in this case. So Battle Garega, Donpachi, Ketsui, DOJ, name them, So this is the transition time between those two styles. So that makes these games pretty unique actually. And so you'll see in the footage here, I haven't played Donpachi in a super long time, so it was kind of fun to play the game again in this context. So I'll begin by talking about Donpachi just because I'm a little more familiar with Cave's background and this game than Sorcerer Striker. So Donpachi is the beginning of the Donpachi series, following up the Toplan game Batsugun. And if you play Batsugun, you can kind of see it as Donpachi embryo, right? Like it had so many elements of Donpachi that you finally see him come sort of form in Donpachi and then come to blossom in Donpachi. So it's kind of fun to go back and play Donpachi because you can see a lot of the prototype ideas for the later Donpachi games in this game. So Akeda and his guys started working on Donpachi. What makes Donpachi really unique, it's the first shmup to introduce chaining, the ever popular, ever famous scoring mechanic that has made its way into many, many games. Of course, there's the Donpachi series where it's basically a staple of the scoring system. But even outside the DDP series, many indie games, many shmups afterward have taken on this chaining system. Like Zero Ranger has chaining, Danmaku Unlimited 3 has chaining. Many other shmups have this chaining system directly from Donpachi and Donpachi. Another cool thing that Donpachi introduced is the laser, right? The concentrated laser. Now, I'm not sure if this is the first shmup to ever use this mechanic of wide shot concentrated laser, but it's one of the earliest, that's for sure. And that has become like a mainstay of bullet hells. I mean, every bullet hell has some kind of focus fire type mechanic in it almost. It's just such a great concept. Again, I don't know if Donpachi was the first to introduce this, but it's definitely one of the first. And so, just speaking of the game and its background, it's a little bit hard to dig up too much information. I read some interviews and things like that. But basically, the combo system was inspired by Street Fighter 2. They like the idea of linking moves together into combinations for more damage in fighting games. So it makes sense to bring that into shmups for more points. I think it's a really fun system. Can be very frustrating and introduces a level of mastery that is pretty unparalleled in other shmups, right? If you're really good at chaining in the Donpachi games, that's a badge of honor because that is by no means an easy task, and even many super players cannot, they can't settle in for the amount of grinding and save stating and all that sort of things usually chaining entails. What's really interesting about chaining in Donpachi is it's, again, kind of a rough prototype of what was to come. And so some of the chaining is much more strict than even Donpachi, which is crazy to think about. And unlike Donpachi, where basically you can chain every stage in Donpachi, there's 1-1 where you can't full chain it because of the mid-boss, but you can basically full chain every stage in Donpachi. Some of those full chains, like I think 1-5, are top secret information or hard to find information on, but it is possible, I believe. I guess Plasma will correct me if there's a stage I'm forgetting, but I believe you can full chain every stage other than 1-1 in Donpachi. So just playing Donpachi, and you can see from the footage here that it's interesting because the bullet speeds in this game and the ship movement feel much more like Batsugun than Donpachi to me. If you sat down and played Donpachi and you sat down and played Batsugun, and Donpachi's in the middle, I kind of feel like Donpachi actually falls a little bit closer to Batsugun as far as it's a little more classic bullet, classic shmup style than a Danmaku bullet hell, because basically the bullet speeds feel like second loop speeds, and some of the bullet formations are just kind of cheap, to be honest. You can see in my first playthrough here, it's been years since I played Donpachi, so I'm basically playing it for the first time. I can't remember any of the bullet patterns. You can see some of them just kind of jank me. Batsugun has that as well, where you basically have to memorize the patterns coming into it. Whereas in Donpachi and bullet hells, the idea behind a bullet hell is cave games always have a way of trapping you and pushing you into a corner. But what makes bullet hells interesting is they give you time to read the patterns and work your way through it much more often than classic shmups. And so you can see how Donpachi's gameplay is a little bit more along the lines of a classic shmup. So that's enough about Donpachi. Now let's talk about Sorcerer Striker, the first Raising game. So before Raising came together, they were part of a studio called Compile. I think the shmups that belong to them that are the most recognizable, forgive me if I'm wrong here, are Spriggan and Zanuck. I believe that's how you pronounce them. Those are some pretty awesome games. And playing Sorcerer Striker, it's really interesting feel, actually, because it doesn't feel quite, like Battle Garega. Battle Garega is kind of close. It honestly feels a little bit closer to like a Psycho game, with the way the bullet speeds work, the way the enemies work. But it's also more creative than a Psycho game and more interesting and strange. And I think I was reading some interviews about this game coming together. It has a pretty interesting background from what I understand. So the art style of this game and kind of the aesthetics of this game are not your typical, obviously not your typical spaceship mecha style. Instead, it's more influenced by fantasy, but it's not straight up fantasy because obviously they have some technology going on there. It's like that magic tech stuff from Final Fantasy, I think, is a good comparison for people who know that. So I kind of like to think of it as the sort of inverse of Cyberpunk, where Cyberpunk is like sci-fi with magic psychic elements going on usually. Not always, but that kind of happens in Cyberpunk. And then this is fantasy with some sci-fi elements mixed in. Really cool aesthetic, really cool style. Much more cheerful and upbeat aesthetics, and from what I remember reading interviews about this, is that what really influenced the aesthetics a lot was the soundtrack. So they're all working on this, from what I recall, in an apartment together. I think it was like 4 or 5 dudes working on a game in an apartment. That's pretty crazy. And the soundtrack, I believe, was coming together faster than the actual game and stuff like that. And so when they're hearing the music for the soundtrack, that was actually inspiring the aesthetics and visual designs of the game. That's why it's really upbeat and bright. And just sitting down and listen, I played these back to back. Played Donpachi, and then I played Sorcerer Striker. There is no contest. Sorcerer Striker has a much better soundtrack than Donpachi. I think, unfortunately, Donpachi and Donpachi struggle in the soundtrack department. Like, I will never imagine myself sitting down to listen to tracks from either of these games. DOJ is when they turn it around, but in Sorcerer Striker, I could listen to this soundtrack. I'm like playing, thinking, okay, this could be in some podcast episodes and stuff. And what's fun about the Raising games is that they kind of have a continuity and like a universe unto themselves where Donpachi does this as well, but I think it's a little more noticeable in the Raising games where, you know, the characters of this game, Gain, Bornum, Cheetah, Miyamoto? I can't remember. The samurai one. Those four are, you know, classic Garega ships too, the hidden ships. And it's funny because it almost feels like the characters from Sorcerer Striker and this series Mahou, or whatever, I think that's how it's pronounced, are kind of more associated with Battle Garega, even though Battle Garega's default style is actually more military, World War II, World War I-esque ships, just because the secret characters are so busted, basically. Battle Garega has become famous for its extra characters, and so whenever I think of Gain, even though Gain is not from Battle Garega, I think of him in the context of Battle Garega. Same with all these other characters, so that's interesting how that works. What I also noticed when I was playing is some of the bosses and stuff from this game end up in Batrider, and it's kind of fun the way Rising does their games and uses different characters and different enemies. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the King of Fighters, where SNK takes characters from all these different games and smashes them together. I kind of like to think of Batrider especially as the King of Fighters of Rising, where you have all these different characters, and it's kind of like this dream matchup. So I think, and that's another cool thing about this game, is it kind of starts the lineage of not only the gameplay style and the characters. Really, the gameplay style of this game is not that different from Garega, other than, I mean, the power-up system's different, but I mean, the kind of the basic core is pretty similar, other than Garega just throws more bullets on the screen, basically. I think the bullets might be a little bit faster in Sorcerer Striker, but not a whole lot. So, yeah, and it has some kind of strange level design at times that's pretty unique. Like the part at the end of the run, I might not show it in the video or not, where in stage 3 I get instantly killed because there's some kind of weird tripwire thing. And so all my gaming instincts have taught me, if there's a tripwire, especially in Shmups, fly through it as fast as possible, and it'll probably shoot a laser behind you. Well, I did that, and this giant wall just came and crushed me. So that was a pretty nasty little booby trap. Yeah, so that's basically the summary of this, is that if you're looking for that nice middle ground between a Danmaku and a classic shmup, kind of that transition phase, these are great titles to look at. The early Cave, the early Raising, Sorcerer Striker, Donpachi, and then you can even go back to maybe late Toplan, so Batsugun, late Compile, and you can kind of, it's really interesting to see how the changes are somewhat significant, but there's still that DNA of those earlier studios in the later games. It's kind of funny how shmup studios remind me sort of anime studios, where they have a lineage, right? Where they have a bigger main studio, then they break off and make a sub-studio. Then that sub-studio breaks off and makes a sub-studio over the years. And they kind of form this family tree of developers and companies and staff. That's kind of what happened here with Compile and Toplan, where they broke off and formed the babies of Cave and Raising, which grew up to be giants of the genre. So who knows, maybe that'll happen again. Some dudes from Raising will break off. It's been a really long time, so I don't know if that's quite likely, but you know, maybe some other studios will form in the DNA of Cave and Raising in the future. That'd be really interesting, like Rolling Gunner, for instance. So thanks so much for watching, and before I go, let me shout out my patrons: Mark Sloan, MAZ, the man behind the video, Nathaniel Davis, N Electron, Plasmo, Psych, Young Money Swee, Dingo, DBL Vision, or Double Vision, Dunpeel 2064, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Gus, Himmel, Kiwi, Jake Ryan, Joe Angelo, K, and Kino Tosi. Thanks for watching.